Welcome to Paranormal M, the portal to the extraordinary stories that push the boundaries of imagination. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications to be part of our ongoing exploration into the inexplicable. Lights with a message. In 2018, my grandfather passed away after 4 years of struggling with dementia, an awful disease that strips a person of almost everything that really makes them who they are. It was a very difficult time for me because, as his only family member, I had to take full responsibility for his finances and important health decisions. Not to mention the guilt I was carrying around, mostly because he was living in a nursing home due to needing 24-hour care. The day after the hospital called to say that he died, I made the 6-hour journey by train to his home. I fumbled my way through the next 3 days, registering his death, arranging his funeral and flowers, contacting the relevant people, all of that. Not really sure if I was doing the right things by him and second-guessing each decision that I did make. After my grandfather's funeral, I returned home, in a state of disbelief that I'd just said goodbye to the last member of my family. I got to bed that night worrying about whether I'd done this and if it was the right thing to do or not. I happened to turn towards the window, just as a beautiful rainbow-patterned light sparkled across my blackout blind. There was one, then two, then loads of these lights, which seemed to be on my blinds. They made me think of the light flashes that you get from a spinning glitter ball. They appeared to rain down and dance across my blinds. These lights were so bright that they were visible in the hallway, as my partner in the other room saw them too. The lights were visible for maybe 7 seconds before fading out. I was scared for a second or two, but then I was just amazed by them. I got a really calming feeling come over me and took the lights to either be my grandfather or be a message from him. I like to think that the message was a thank you, or maybe an all is well. For the next half hour, I tried recreating the lights in order to come up with some kind of rational explanation, but I couldn't. No light ever comes through that blind, nor does any light come through the blind in the other bedroom. There are no windows in the hallway. I've not seen the light since. Anyway, not a scary experience. In fact, it kind of gave me comfort when I needed it. It was like my grandfather acknowledged everything that I'd done for him, which at the time he was still alive and he wasn't really aware of. The Hooded Monk. This was a story told to me by my grandfather years before he had passed away. My grandparents were both born in the first half of the 1920s, and they were brought up by my parents and family who were very much Victorian in their ways. What you saw is what you got. They were both highly intelligent, honest, hardworking, and didn't have time for BS. To say I was surprised by my grandfather telling me a ghost story is a massive understatement. He began by asking me, "Have we ever told you about the monk?" Anyway, my grandfather said that a few years beforehand, my grandma had gotten up out of bed at about 6 a.m. and made her way downstairs to make a pot of tea. This was her everyday routine, one that she'd been doing each day of her married life for the past 60 years. My grandma walked along the hall, toward the kitchen, ahead of her, and on her way she saw my grandfather in the dining room, on the right-hand side of the hall. She saw him by the sideboard, wearing what she assumed was his dressing gown, hood up over his head. My grandma had called out, "Morning, Ken," and continued on her way to the kitchen. After making the pot of tea, my grandma had taken the tea tray into the lounge and discovered my grandfather, dressed in his clothes, sat up in his chair reading the newspaper. She had made a comment on how he'd got dressed quickly this morning, and confused by the comment, he asked what she meant. That's when Grandma had told him that she'd seen him 5 minutes ago in the dining room, dressed in his dressing gown. She said that she'd called out to him, but perhaps he'd not heard her with that hood up over his head. My grandfather was now even more confused, because he didn't even have a hood on his dressing gown. They laughed the event off, putting it down to hallucinations caused by deteriorating eyesight. But my grandfather said he was a bit worried at the time that it could just be a sign of dementia. To a couple in their 80s, dementia is far more scary of a prospect than seeing a ghost. My grandparents didn't talk about this strange incident again until the same thing happened to my grandfather sometime later. He had been to the bathroom, which was opposite the lounge, and from there you could see half of the dining room. He told me that he had come out of the bathroom to return to the lounge, and as he walked across the hall, he caught sight of my grandma in her dressing gown with the hood up, walking towards the dining room window. By the time he reached the lounge, he realized that this was not my grandma, and he headed into the dining room to investigate. There was nobody in the dining room, and my grandma was in the kitchen. My grandfather told me that. He was immediately relieved that he'd seen the person in the hood too, because that meant my grandma wasn't quote-unquote losing it. And two, he believed that they had seen a ghost, and because of the hooded robe that it wore, they decided that it must be a monk. Hearing my grandfather talking about ghosts was great. It was a subject I never dreamt of discussing with him. Hearing this completely genuine person tell me they'd seen a ghost of a monk just solidified my belief in the paranormal. It scared the shit out of me too, though. The quote-unquote wigglers. After leaving my mom's house and moving from place to place with my dad for a couple of years, we eventually moved into our very own home. We'd been living with his new girlfriend, but that had broken down and we ended up sofa surfing for a while. So it felt really good to be settled in our own home. My friends from secondary school lived close by. I had my bedroom and things were just easier. As I was getting older and more independent at this time, I'd often be in the house alone. I'd get home from school before my dad finished work, and some evenings my dad would be out. It was when I was on my own that I realized I didn't feel like I was on my own, and that feeling of dread I knew too well had returned. Like at my mom's house, the feeling would come. Then it would begin to build and build until it was unbearable. The space between our front room and dining room at the bottom of the stairs is where I would sense something hanging around. Whenever I passed the foot of the stairs, I would get the feeling something was up there, waiting to pounce. I'd usually rush across the space, but sometimes I would walk it and brave a quick glance upstairs. Whenever I felt uneasy, I would pretend that someone was home with me, and I'd call out something like, "I'll be there now in a minute, Dad," thinking that I could trick the scary something into believing I wasn't alone. I would hear things walking or moving upstairs, or just out of view in another room. That sensation someone was lurking behind me happened regularly. I would have to leave the house and sit outside until I felt the fear subside and I could go back in. The worst ever experience in that house was when my dad had gone out with his new girlfriend one night and I was home with my 2 cats. I also had my dad's girlfriend's dog with me, a beautiful German Shepherd type dog. I'd been watching TV downstairs most of the evening, but I began feeling uneasy in the front room. So I went upstairs to my bedroom to distract myself with a book or a magazine, with one of my cats next to me on the bed, and the dog sat on the floor next to my bed. That damned feeling of something lurking was still there and beginning to build. I noticed my cat looking to the window wall that had a boiler there on the wall. Health and safety. She was sat fixated on something. I then turned to the dog. She was sat rigid and upright, nose pointing forwards, looking to the exact same spot as the cat was. My heart sank. That awful terror turned my stomach and gave me an instant cold sweat. Slowly, I turned back to look where they were looking, to see whatever they could see, and I saw it. Coming from the area of the boiler, there were 4 smoky, misty balls, orbs, and a chain. The only way I could describe it at the time was that it moved like a wiggler, the caterpillar in Mario. They were not joined together, but they were moving together, away from the wall in midair, near where the boiler was. Now, this was not smoke. It was not something to do with the boiler. It was something else, but what? I don't know. They were a white, pale gray color, not solid, nor totally see-through. They were like tennis ball-sized bubbles filled with smoke, but with no obvious edges. The smoke or mist was moving in a way that it gave the impression of a ball shape, completely unlike anything I'd ever seen. So totally horrified, I grabbed my cat, got off the bed, called the dog to follow me, opened the door, and we ran. We ran straight down the stairs to the front room, through the porch and out onto the doorstep. It was late, dark, and very cold, but I was too terrified to go back in. We sat there for a couple of hours, and the dog in the porch area, me on the cold concrete steps until gone past midnight, waiting for my dad and his girlfriend to come home. They were shocked to find me sat out there when they came back. They were obviously concerned about the fact that I'd been so scared inside. I chose to sit outside. However, I don't think they believed me when I told them about the wigglers. Darkness within the dark. At our house, we could often hear footsteps upstairs. We would be sat in our front room and hear the steps through the ceiling, followed by the creaks that the steps caused within the floorboards. Mom and Dad would simply put it down to the house settling at the end of the day. I wasn't convinced at the time. I'm still not. Although it was a very pleasant room with no creepiness happening in it, I can remember being really annoyed that my parents put me in the bedroom that they did. They had taken the attic room for themselves, and I was scared that if the unknown something that I felt within the house came up the stairs, it would get me first, and they would be too far away to save me. The stairs went up from the ground floor to the small landing, with my room directly on the left and the other bedroom to the right. You had to take a step up to the right to get to the other room, crossing the hallway which ran back parallel to the stairs. So that room had a buffer from the stairs, if you see what I mean. I moaned and begged to be moved to the bedroom opposite, as it felt safer being in there. However, once I moved into that bedroom, I began experiencing scary stuff. I would lie awake in bed, in the total dark. I could see what I always described as darker areas of darkness. Shadow people? I hated it. Some of the darkness would begin to gather together and then swirl. Others would form the shape of a figure. I still worry about seeing the dark shapes in the darkness now, so I tend to have a light on or keep my eyes closed until I get the light on. I really do not want to see the darkness within the dark ever again. Often I would get the feeling of being watched, as though there was somebody standing behind me, or that someone had entered my room. Yet, when I turned around to see who it was, no one was there. You generally know if someone is looking at you without actually seeing them doing so. You get a feeling and look up, or turn around and you catch them at it. Well, this was that feeling. Another feeling I got was a change in the atmosphere, so it felt kind of heavy and claustrophobic. Sometimes I would get some sort of adrenaline rush, a fight or flight type reaction, an odd, panicky dread feeling in my tummy or chest, kind of like being at the top of the hill on a roller coaster, just before you tip over the edge and go back down. The feeling of impending doom, one could say. There were many types of strangeness occurring in that house, but I think the last scary thing I experienced there was when I was about 9 and I was actually living there anymore. I wasn't there. My dad had moved out, and after a while, I'd gone to live with him. I had returned to visit my mom for the overnight stay. All I remember about the visit was going to bed that night, absolutely terrified that I was going to see the dark patches of dark moving about, forming shapes. Gecko. And giving me that awful feeling of panic terror. I eventually got myself to sleep, and I had been sleeping for a few hours when I woke with a start. I sat up and could see that it was still very dark around me, and I began to panic. I fumbled about for the lamp behind me and tried to feel for the switch. After what seemed like forever, but was probably only 5 seconds, I found the switch and pushed it. Bang! The stupid bloody light bulb blew out. I crawled to the end of my bed and went for the switch on the wall for the main light. That bulb flickered on briefly before popping out of existence, plunging me back into darkness. At that moment, I felt extremely unwelcome in my old bedroom in my mom's house. It felt like the house wanted me out. It reminded me of the previous time that the bulb had blown in the front room. It made me think of the time I got told off for turning off the stereo that I didn't even touch, the horrible footsteps and constant noises around the place. I just felt like the house wanted me to go. Anyway, I did go. I stayed living with my dad and left that creepy old house behind. Unfortunately, whatever it was that had been haunting the house seemed to actually be haunting me, and within a couple of years, it had gone bad again. The house hated me. More from the house in England. I remember sitting in the living room with my mom one time, when I was about maybe 6 or 7 years old. She was reading a book. Mom loved her books, and was listening to the radio. I was not enjoying the music, and I think because I wanted the TV on, I had moaned and just asked if we could turn off the stereo. Mom said no, and I was sulking. Now, to turn the radio off, you had to physically switch this button from left to right, or push a different button to turn off just the radio. I know this for sure as I actually had this stereo until about 3 years ago. Anyway, after a bit of this, it's not fair from me, and my mom managed to calm me down and got back to reading her book, as I once again sat doing my coloring book. A short time passed and the room went silent. The stereo had been turned off. My mom was not impressed, as she obviously thought I'd gone against what she had just said. Although I initially found it quite funny, thinking I'd mysteriously gotten my way after all, I soon became upset and angry because my mom didn't believe that I'd not switched it off. She'd been convinced that it was me because of the fact that the switch had been moved across and couldn't just happen on its own. Somehow, my mom thought I'd gotten up, gone across the room, switched it off, and then returned to my coloring book within a matter of seconds without being seen or heard. There were often times when the house, or whatever it was causing these things to happen, made me feel very, very unwelcome. It felt as though the house just hated me. Probably sounds nuts, but that's the feeling that I got. Another time, one evening, Mom and I were again sat in the living room, chilling out. I know it was evening time because the little table lamp was switched on. I was actually watching the TV this time. And guess what? Guess what my mom was doing? That's right, reading a book. So anyway, we're in there enjoying our own things when the light bulb died. It popped quite loudly and blinked out. Now this is a relatively normal occurrence, but what made this really bizarre was that my mom started laughing to herself and then said something like, "That's weird, I just read in my book, then bam, the lights went out." She showed me the page that she was on and the words were there in black and white. Probably just some sort of random coincidence, which was quite funny at the time, but looking back at it with all the other stuff that was going on, it's a little creepy. Footsteps on the stairs. I lived with my parents in a small village in England from the mid-'80s to early '90s. The house was built of thick stone and had 4 floors. On the ground floor was the living room and dining room. The first floor had 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. The top floor was an attic bedroom, and from the dining room on the ground floor, you went down a set of wooden stairs to the lower floor. This was originally the cellar, basement, but had been converted into a kitchen at some point before we had moved in. Over the years, we experienced many strange going-ons in this house, and we often heard movement from upstairs. My parents explained this away as the house settling, but even at the age of 7, I knew it was more than just timbers expanding and contracting with the temperature changes. We got the normal creaks and cracks, but you'd also hear shuffling and dragging type sounds, along with occasional footsteps across the ceiling. Also, the house created this feeling of fear. It was like a negative charge that would build and build until something happened. A feeling of impending doom hanging in the air. Just before my 8th birthday, my parents broke up and my dad moved out of the house. One afternoon, my mom had to go out somewhere and I was left home alone. Excuse me. At this point, I had turned 8, and although probably a little young to be left alone, I wasn't going to be for long, and my best friend actually lived right next door, so I could knock round if I needed anything. I decided to go play Captain Planet on my Commodore Amiga, which was set up on the desk in the dining room. I'm sat there facing toward the wall adjoining my neighbors, my back to the doorway into the living room. On my right-hand side was the doorway to the wooden staircase and the wall which obscured my view of those stairs. At some point, I became aware of slight movement in the kitchen, and then it happened. There was a footstep on the stairs, a very clear and precise footstep on a wooden step in an empty house. The feeling of dread swept in and my heart sank in my stomach as I heard a second step on that staircase. Now, because these stairs are wooden, you could actually hear where someone was on those stairs. The bottom step was a very low, solid sound, whereas the top was a much higher pitch and almost hollow sounding. Then I heard the next step. They were slow steps and definitely coming up toward me. I started to get my feet ready to run when I completely froze. I was scared stiff and couldn't make my legs work. I had never been so unbelievably terrified in my life. So the steps continued, and the pitch of them was getting higher and higher. I knew that in a matter of seconds, the who or what was going to be up high enough for me to see them through the doorway, and this was too much to bear. I had to get out now. so I literally pushed myself off the desk with my hands and more or less dragged myself along by grabbing on pieces of furniture. My legs went from totally dead to jelly-like, and I managed to get myself into the living room and out the front door. I knocked on my neighbor's door, and my friend's dad ran round to check who was in the house. Yet, there was nobody there. I stayed next door until my mom came back, and she verified that she had not returned earlier on, so they were not her footsteps. The incident was put down to just your imagination playing tricks on you. But I know what I heard, and I know how badly it terrified me. I never heard the footsteps on the stairs again, thankfully. But I did continue to have other experiences. Although I was scared in that house, I'm glad I got to experience it at all, as it's made me who I am today. Something follows me. I was about 4 years old when I first saw it. My stepfather at the time warned me not to get too close to the trees or it would get me. But I wanted to play outside anyway, so I stepped outside and peered around because the trailer I lived in at that time was right next to a forest. And when I turned to look at the corner that was near the trees, a black, massive thing with yellow eyes peered around the side at me and grabbed the side of the house with inky claws. For years, I asked my mother what it was because she's no longer with said stepfather. And she doesn't remember anything from that night besides me running inside screaming and crying. My stepfather at that time had no recollection of ever warning me of anything either. Eventually, I forgot about it, till 3 years ago. I was sharing a room with a roommate, and we were home alone and laughing. I got up to go get snacks, but she suddenly stops laughing and says, "Don't go out there, he's waiting for you," which of course struck an intense fear within me. I asked her to repeat what she just said, and immediately she looked confused and said, "I didn't say anything." Obviously, I was freaked out and made her leave the room first. Thankfully, nothing happened. But as I lived in that apartment, I dreamt about that thing crawling out of my closet and trapping me in my room. I could see that it had large antlers and the body of a man, inky claws, and a rabbit skull for a head. It got to the point where I asked to switch rooms because I thought it was just me being paranoid about the closet. But then my roommate, when she took over the room, claims that she woke up to something standing in the corner, watching her. She described the antlers, but for some reason, didn't bother to mention it to her, so she stayed in the room. Eventually, I moved into where I live now, and in the back of the house is once again against a lining of trees. I work third shift, so when I leave for work, every now and then I get very sickly scared of just the trees and my gut feeling that it's going to come around the corner, so I run to the car. This feeling happened 2 nights ago, and I don't know what it is, but I'm afraid it's trying to find me. And it's upsetting because hardly anyone takes me seriously about it lately. It doesn't feel like a demon. It feels more than that. More cryptid-like. I've Googled anything that might resemble antlers, a rabbit skull, and the body of a man. It also just looks like it dipped itself in a lot of ink and tar. I used to call it the boogeyman, but now I'm not sure. I know it wants to do me harm, though. Ghosts in the Bathroom, the Courthouse Hotel, London. Most of my friends at the time lived or worked in the area, so there was usually something fun going on after I finished my shift. which was normally 7 p.m. One evening, 3 of my friends were in town and ended up heading to the courthouse London for dinner. If you walk down Carnaby Street towards Liberty, London, the courthouse is just at the bottom, over the road. It's a pretty swish hotel with a bar and a restaurant, but it used to be a magistrate's court. It still has a lot of the original features, including the old jail cells, where you can have drinks in the courtroom and the restaurant seating area. Anyway, one of my friends had planned ahead and booked us a table. Although we turned up, there was only one other couple dining in there as far as I can remember. It was a weeknight, so I wasn't busy at all. We had dinner and chatted. The night was like any other night. Any other night out for dinner, that is. And I'm not a big drinker. I don't remember drinking at all, but if I did, it would have only been a glass of wine, so I was in no way drunk. I excused myself and told my friends that I'm just popping to the bathroom, back in a minute, and off I went. So the layout may have changed. I haven't been in many years, but at the time, the bathroom layout was as follows. There was a door you had to push, a short corridor, another door you had to push open, and then you were in the bathroom. Both doors were heavy and swung closed behind you once you'd gone through them. The bathroom was a smallish room, but nice as far as bathrooms go. There were 3 empty cubicles, all with the doors neatly open. I went into the right-hand side toilet and closed the door. As I was sat using the toilet, sorry, I know, I began to hear what sounded like whispering behind me. Behind and perhaps just off the right. It made me turn around, but I just thought to myself it must be something coming from the room next door. The whispering continued, but I couldn't really make out what was being said. Surprisingly, I was chilled and didn't think anything of it. It was just someone in the room next door, right? The next thing was knock, knock, knock. 3 pretty loud knocks rapped on my toilet door. Now, I'm in a pretty confused mindset. I thought one of my friends must have come into the bathroom and decided to knock on my door for some strange reason. I was finished using the toilet and opened up the door expecting to see my friend, or someone, but there was nobody there. The room was completely empty with all of the cubicles just as they were when I entered, with the doors still open. There was absolutely nobody in the room with me. Plus, if someone had come in, knocked on my door, and ran out again, I would have heard the door and the footsteps, but there was nothing, just silence. And why would somebody do that anyway? The hotel is pretty fancy. They wouldn't just let people run amok in it. So at this point, I was puzzled, but still surprisingly chilled. I think my mind just went to a rational place at the time. But the whispering? What was that about? I returned to my table and asked my friends if they'd knocked on my toilet door, and they all said no. They were kind of freaked out and didn't want to use the bathroom alone after that, which I guess is understandable. Terrified at night at my late grandma's house. So this is a true story that happened in 2014, and I still think about it all the time. My grandma passed away on New Year's Eve in 2008, going into 2009, and the house that she'd lived in her whole life. She was an absolutely amazing lady who'd do anything for anyone but was really ill in her final years with Parkinson's. The last time I saw her was in Christmas of 2008, and she was gone a few days after I traveled back to London. I always wish I'd stayed with her longer. If only I'd known that that would have been the last time that I'd see her. After she passed away, my parents moved into her house and sold theirs. It's a pretty small dormer bungalow with all the bedrooms upstairs. Every Christmas, myself, sisters, and brother would travel back home to the north and stay over for a few days. As there isn't a whole lot of room, I opted to sleep in the living room on a pull-out sofa bed, which I'd done many times before. To be fair, the house has always had kind of creepy vibes. I pretty much grew up at my grandma's house, and she would look after us whilst my parents were at work. So night one, I wasn't thinking anything creepy or scary at all, although I did leave a small lamp on. I'm so used to living in London, with the constant noises and bright night skies. Up north in this remote village, it's pitch black at night and eerily quiet. It can be hard to sleep. It's just a bit too quiet. I noticed the room was very cold, although the real coal fire had been on and was slowly ebbing away, but I slept fine, nothing really unusual. Night 2. Just the same as the other night, really. The room was a bit chilly, but nothing out of the ordinary. I was pretty tired after running around playing with my nephew all day, so thought maybe I'd have a deeper sleep if I turned the small lamp off that I'd had on previously. I wasn't scared of the dark or anything like that. I really didn't think much of it. Over the years, I'd slept over in that room loads of times. So I fell asleep around 11 p.m. maybe. I can't quite remember the exact time. Around 2 a.m., I suddenly woke up out of nowhere with a sudden jolt of absolute fear and terror running through me. I was hyperventilating and felt so hot that I was sweating. But as I jolted awake in fear, I could feel someone was holding onto my hand, too. I slept on my right side with my right arm and hand kind of turned up on the pillow next to me. And I could feel a hand in my hand, holding it. My God, I've never been so terrified in all of my life. I mustered all of the energy I had, jumped out of bed in the pitch-black room and scrambled for the light switch. Obviously, there was no one there. I wasn't dreaming anything before I woke up, but it felt so real. I felt a hand. Plus, I wasn't feeling ill or anything. What I felt was just sheer terror. This has never happened before or since. I didn't sleep the rest of the night and was knackered the following day. We had a family meal booked at a restaurant, and I told them what happened. I expected them to laugh at me, but my mom and dad looked at each other and said a few weird things had happened since they moved in, including a glass that likes to move by itself fairly frequently at the odd bump in the night. My mom won't go downstairs at night unless she really needs to. So, if it was my grandma who came to pay me a visit, I'm sure that she wasn't trying to frighten me, but geez, I've never slept in that room again and never will. In the garage of the same house when we were younger, my little sister once said that she saw the ghost of a man wearing a military uniform. I'll have to ask her about that one. Noise from the back. Many moons ago, when I was in my late 20s, I was a waitress. I worked mostly nights. I had 2 small kids, and we lived in a pretty big place with my aunt. Yep, the very same. My car had broken down, and my aunt was taking me to and from work. The road to and from work wasn't too long, but it was curvy and narrow and very dark at night, even when the moon was bright. The trees were close to the road and grew in an almost tunnel throughout most of the road. This one particular night, it was after midnight by the time that we were heading home. My aunt is driving and I'm in the passenger seat, counting out my tips. I hear some rustling coming from the back floorboards and asked H about it. At first, she hadn't heard anything, but eventually she did. Our initial thought was kittens. We had small kittens at the house, and they were kind of bad at jumping into vehicles anytime the door was open. We pulled to the side of the road when we came to a spot that was wide enough so we could have a look. The car was a two-door, so we had to push the seats up to take a look in the back. There were some newspapers in the back floorboards, and it was these that we had heard rustling. We picked everything up but didn't find anything. Next thought, a breeze from our window. We had them down maybe an inch or two. Maybe it was disturbing the papers. No big deal, right? So we got back in the car and continued on. When we started hearing it again, it was quite a bit louder and bigger somehow. This is much more than a breeze. But we try to ignore it until something starts hitting the back of my seat. Not real hard, almost like a small kid lightly kicking my seat. I look at my aunt and said, "Something is hitting my seat." She thought it was maybe just trying to pull her leg and didn't believe me. Then it got hard enough that she could actually see me bouncing from the impact. So I, being the not very smart person that I am, decide to unbuckle my seatbelt and take a peek to see what's going on. No one ever accused me of having all my dogs barking. My aunt slowed down a bit. Remember, we can get off the road again, no room. And I'm on my knees on the passenger seat facing the back. The back of my seat is still being banged on, but I couldn't see anything. I leaned over the back of the seat to get a better look when, bang! The seat was hit so hard, the locking mechanism that keeps it in place was broken. The whole seat was rammed up into the dash and it slung me into the dashboard hard. I was split open behind my right ear and ended up in the front floorboard. Damn. Of course, my aunt hit the brakes and we were stopped in the middle of the road, which is at least as dangerous as what was going on inside the car. I just scrambled back into the seat, buckled my seatbelt, and told my aunt to fucking floor it, get me home. We were just a couple of miles from home, and we took those curves like a race car. As soon as we roared into the driveway, we jumped out and ran to the house. If I'm not mistaken, my aunt didn't even turn the motor off. It may have just been us running out of gas and it just sitting there. I do know that I didn't shut the door, and H swears that neither did she. But they were both closed and the doors locked the next morning. Luckily, she had an extra key. But my happy ass never got in that car ever again. Another story from someone in the back seat. This story happened about a year later. The person in the back seat was still quite frequently in my mom's and aunt's cars. They became used to it. As I said, occasionally they could see him in their rearview mirror, but usually he could only be seen from outside the cars. On this occasion, Mom and my aunt were taking a bit longer ride and were, as usual, listening to their radio pretty loudly and singing along. Their ride had taken them past their paternal grandmother's gravesite. Now, y'all need a little bit of background here. Grandmother, my great-grandma, was a bad mamma jamma. Everyone said she was a witch. This being the South, anyone even remotely different was called a witch. So that makes me, kind of never mind it. However, this woman was into devil worship. She was not a Satanist. There's a huge difference. No, She was into animal sacrifice, blood rituals, all things ugly. Trust me, she wasn't a good person. She detested my grandmother, the lady who married and had children with her son, because my grandmother wouldn't take any of her shit, and other things which I won't get into. So, on her deathbed, and this was witnessed by several people, including a doctor, mind you, she swore that she would come back through one of Granny's children or grandchildren, and that she would never allow them to live in peace. Also, I'll mention that my pawpaw, her son, wasn't like her, but his sisters and father were. Is this clear as mud? Okay, on with the story. On this bright, beautiful day, the road Mom and my aunt were on was really twisty and windy and hilly. They knew the roads pretty well. They traveled them quite often and didn't think anything unusual would happen today. They were wrong. Laughing and singing, all was hunky-dory until they passed this graveyard. They've always gotten chills passing here, but nothing really happened to them before. This day, just as they were going past, they actually felt like something got in the car with them, suddenly. They got cold on a summer day. The radio suddenly cut out, and they said they smelled what they assumed was roadkill, rotten meat, basically. Then something weighed them down and held them against the seats. Neither could move at all. They even had trouble taking a deep breath or saying anything, because the weight on their chest was so heavy. Then Mom, she was driving, suddenly felt her foot getting heavier and heavier on the gas pedal. The car was going faster and faster on this winding, twisting road. She couldn't take her foot off the gas, couldn't move even her other foot to the brake. Couldn't move their hands, not even their head. Only their eyes could move. The car was going so fast it was starting to shudder and shake. However, they were kept on the road, went around the curve safely, and had no accident. Mom was able to glance into the rearview mirror and saw that the passenger was with them again. Suddenly, after what felt like ages, the weight was lifted from them and they could control both their body and the car. The cold and the smell were gone, and it was like nothing had happened at all. Of course, they were terribly shaken and had to pull over and get out of the car. They have no idea how they were able to come off that road safely, except to assume that their passenger helped them somehow. Now, obviously, some of y'all are going to call this bullshit, and that's okay. I was raised on the story and still find it hard to believe. However, I will say that I've heard this story from each of them more times than I can count. Neither of them have ever had the slightest change in the story. And, to this day, neither of them will even tell me where the road is. I know it isn't too far from where I grew up. Obviously, I can't even tell you for sure what country it's in. No one in the family will even speak her name, and even the ones who once knew where she was buried swear they can't remember when asked. They'll shut down any questions immediately. Any and all records that they have were destroyed, and back then nothing was kept outside of the family. Someone in the back seat. This experience happened to my aunt and mom before I was even thought of. My mom and dad were just starting to date at this time. I will tell it as if it was told to me the many times over the years that it has. My mom and aunt did everything together. They even worked together. On their days off, they just get in my mom's car and just ride around. We still do this, by the way, one of my favorite things. One particular day, they got several calls on the CB radio. This was back in the 60s. from friends or family that they'd pass, asking them who they were all riding around with. Everybody knew that they never took others on their rides. Of course, it was just the two of them. They didn't understand why people were getting upset and asking them why they would lie about something so insignificant as to who was in the car. My dad even called on the CB and got really upset because they didn't ask him to go for their ride. It was a sister's thing, and yet they had some other dude with them. He assumed it was my aunt's boyfriend or something. So my great aunt ended up behind them, really small town in the south, and asked them, "Can you all pull over and come back to my car and help me with something?" Kind of confused but willing to help, they said, "Of course," and they did so. When they got back from my great aunt's car, she said, "Is something going on? Why don't you want anyone to know you have somebody in your car?" Thinking maybe they were being forced or some such, right? Mom, getting pissed at this point. "For crying out loud, no one is in the damn car, look!" And turned around and pointed, only to see some guy in their back seat. They swore he wasn't in there before and that he must have snuck or sneaked in when they were getting gas or something. But they didn't see him at all. They figured he must have been down in the floor or something, hiding. So they radio over to get some guys to come check it out. This whole time, the guy didn't even fidget. Some big, buff guys, friends of the family, came over and figured that they'd give this guy a, what's it for sneaking into this car, and went up to pull the dude out. When they got to the car, he wasn't there. They came back to ask where he went, but looking back at the car, he was still right there. One of the guys actually got into the back seat where you could plainly see this dude and no one was in there. From outside the car, you could see both of them in the back seat, but on the inside was only him. Now, growing up hearing this, I started to think, this has to have grown in the retelling, right? This is purely impossible. So, at different times, I contacted each person that I could who were involved in this, and they each told me the exact same story from their point of view. I can't explain any more than they could. This only ever happened in their cars. It happened in my aunt's car, too. And only if it was one or both of them in the car. This was the first time that it happened, but it did happen several times after. The dude could never be seen inside the car, only from the outside. A phone call with Sandy. So to set the scene, I was about 7 years old when this happened. But I remember parts of it like it was yesterday. Also, this story is told often in my family, so I can confidently tell it from all other points of views. My parents both worked at this time. My dad was a firefighter, and he has 24 48-hour shifts. And so my eldest sister, 14 at the time, was often left to babysit. There were 7 of us, including the eldest ranging from age 14 to 16. Also, our grandmother lived just across the parking lot from us. My sisters were calling the request line to request a song to be played on the radio. Yep, I'm aging myself here. And my sister, brother, and I were jumping on Mom and Dad's bed, just down the hall from the living room. Now, we had an extension phone upstairs, and we had smaller ones that we were known to listen in on phone conversations with. So when somebody picked up the extension phone while my sister was on her phone in the living room, she assumed it was us. It happened several times, but it would hang up when my eldest sister yelled, "Hang it up!" Finally, she got irate and called us out by name. When she called our names, we came out of our parents' room down the hall, where there was no extension. Obviously, this struck her as weird, but she just figured that she either imagined the sound of the phone picking up or it was a glitch. Once she had all of us sitting in the floor in front of her watching a movie on TV, and she started to call again. This time, when the upstairs phone was picked up, she ignored it. But then she heard breathing sounds over the line. She said, "Hello?" a couple times. Then she hung up the phone. A little freaked out, she called her aunt to see if she could explain it. On the phone with H, it happened again. That's the aunt. But just sounded like an open line. She said it was probably just a glitch, but to call it back if it kept happening. Well, it did. They called again, and the line was picked up. "Who is it?" And a voice said, "This is Sandy." "Where are you, Sandy?" And the voice said, "Well, I'm just right here." She thought about it was one of us, maybe, and said so. Said it couldn't be us, because we're all right here. Then the voice on the line giggled and said, "I'm still here." They spoke with each other and told us to gather, all of us, and just go to Granny's house now. I remember running to Granny's place in the middle of the night barefooted. The aunt told her mom, our other grandma, that somebody was in our apartment and to call the police and tell them to meet us there. The police and everyone else, my mom and dad by now, went in and searched our apartment top to bottom. No one was found, but the upstairs phone was off the hook. The police figured that either we played a joke, or someone had been in the apartment with us. They left, perhaps. So after making sure the windows and doors were locked up, they all met us outside in front of the apartment to talk. The one policeman looked up at the window facing the parking area, the bedroom I shared with one of my sisters, incidentally, and saw a man standing in the window watching them. When the policeman pointed him out to the others, the man just waved and turned away out of sight. They all ran back in to do another search, keeping someone at all exit points to catch anyone running out. No one was found. Was it my imagination? When I was around the age of 3 or 4, by the way, I'm 22 now, I lived in a decent-sized apartment with my parents. My mother was starting to go to Christian church and becoming more spiritual as well, and my father was not really into those type of things. So during those times as a kid, I didn't know anything about the spiritual world. But one day I was playing in my parents' room, and one of my toys fell underneath our cabinets. As I crouched down to pick it up, I felt like I needed to get lower to see more of what was underneath the cabinet for some reason. As I look, I see 2 eyes looking at me from the shadows, and they were yellowish eyes, but with no pupils, and you couldn't see the whites of the eyes. But I didn't feel fear at all, and as a naive kid, I thought we had a pet hiding there, but now that I remember, I never had any pets during my childhood. After I walked away that day, I remembered about the eyes, and decided to bring it food, because I thought it might be hungry. But as I look under the cabinet, there was nothing there. No eyes, just shadows. But my attention span was short, so I just left eating the snacks I brought. But over the years, as I started growing and maturing, I keep wondering what it was. Because now that I think about it, the space underneath the cabinet was not even that big. I would say 1.5 feet deep and 2.5 feet wide. Which, if there actually was an animal there, I would at least see the body. Story from a non-believer. Why I'm changing my opinion. I've always been somewhat skeptical of ghosts. I've always had people around me who attributed things to ghosts, even when a logical explanation was available. My opinion has begun to change. I began living alone. No big deal. I'm not afraid of the house settling or bumps or bangs. I have dogs and they knock stuff over all the time. I recently got an Oculus. I cleared the room and made my sort of play space. I also keep my dogs out of the room so they don't get hit or get stepped on by accident while I'm playing. So I'm playing my game, the TV was off, and after playing for a while, I noticed sound on my TV is on as well as the speaker. I take my headset off, look around, and turn both off. I started playing again, and then I noticed my watch alarm going off. It's a digital watch that I've never set an alarm for. I rarely wear it. It was sitting in the drawer. So I think, okay, my Oculus is somehow sending a signal and these are somehow being affected by it. I start playing and have this weird feeling like someone is in there. I look over my shoulder. You can tap the side of the Oculus and the screen shows you your surroundings using your camera. I don't see anything, but I see a big dog looking at something, not me. I scanned the room and nothing. I started playing again, with my dog after all, but I can't shake the feeling. So I check again this time, taking my headset off. My dog is still looking behind me. There's nothing there but open space. I put the headset up for the night because it just felt that weird. I've lived in this house for about 7 years and never felt this feeling before here. Fast forward to yesterday. I'm playing with some friends in my Oculus. I hear my TV turn on and my friends also hear it. This time it was a TV in another room. So I turn it off. I see the controller in the middle of the floor. It's a guest room where the TV is rarely used. The remote is always directly below the mounted TV on the console. It's just sat there for months without moving. I keep getting the feeling of being watched, but not always, just intermittently. I don't know what to think. I've always been skeptical about ghosts, but I can't explain the remote. Maybe somehow the Oculus messes with electronics, but looking online, I haven't found any proof of this happening to anyone else. I'll update on any more occurrences. Story from a Non-Believer, Part 2. I'm back with more odd things, but not while playing. So, to preface this cannot be caused by some interference or by my dogs. My Oculus is on the other side of the house, shut off. I have cameras set up in my house. There is one pointed at the front doorway, 2 exterior, and 1 in my room. Today I was at work. While at work, I closed the door to my bedroom so my dogs didn't go there. I always keep them out of the bedroom unless I'm home. So I'm at work, and I get a notification that there's movement caught on my camera at home. I think, oh, maybe it's my dogs. But I see it's from my bedroom. So I begin thinking someone broke in or something. So I checked the feed. So I checked the still image that it captured. I see nothing. I brush it off, maybe a bug or something activated it. 2 minutes pass, and I get another notification of movement again. I check, nothing. I watch the feed again, this time for 5 minutes. I don't see anything. I begin to think maybe some lights are just reflecting or some form of light is causing the camera to think that there's movement. As I'm watching the feed, I'm trying to look for some source of light. I have double blackout curtains, so they block light quite well. I have the lights off and no fans, and HVAC is running during the day when I'm not home. got bored of watching the feed and just shut it off because I didn't see anything alarming. Within a minute, I get another notification of movement. I watch the feed, put my earbuds in, and listen as closely as I can. It's quiet, but like you'd expect an empty house to be. I watch again for 10 minutes or so. I debated calling my neighbor and having him check it out, but I decided not to. Usually any loud or odd occurrence would cause my dogs to bark, but I haven't heard them once on the feed or gotten a sound notification, just ones for movement. I finally stopped watching, thinking maybe the settings for movement notifications are just too strict. So I raised the tolerance to high. I closed the app, and in 5 minutes I got another notification. I'm at work, so I didn't notice the notification right away. I checked my phone 15 minutes later. I have 6 notifications for movement. I check all the stills. They all look identical, nothing out of the place. Nothing different from each picture. I decided something's gotta be up with this camera. I get a few more notifications before I'm off of work. When I get home, I check the room, and nothing changed from that morning. Everything is as I left it. Of course, I walk in and get a movement notification. I checked it and saw myself in the still photo. I test the tolerance by laying in my bed and turning over. The camera does not notify me. So the tolerance changed to high doesn't notify me by this movement, which in my opinion is more than slight. I did a full turn and nothing. So I don't know how it was getting set off earlier in the day. I have never changed the tolerance settings before now, and I've never gotten false movement notifications either. This camera has been installed for about 1.5 years as well. I don't know what could have set it off. None of the other cameras notified except once or twice for my dogs laying in the front door. I'm stumped on what could explain it. Now, I'm logically minded, so I've been trying to come up with something and I just can't. There's nothing in the images and nothing that's been moved. It's just my camera notifying me starting at 1:03 p.m. to 3:53 p.m. It's odd. I can't come up with an explanation as to why I got 16 movement notifications in those hours. B&B encounter in 1998. These events happened in the winter of 1998. My first and only experience of this kind. We were driving, returning from a 1,000-kilometer, 600-mile trip. Our plan was to stop halfway, have dinner, find a place to stay. We left rather late, and being winter, it was getting dark and cold. Not much visibility as it was foggy. We decided to stop at this small town, no more than 1,000 inhabitants. The few motels were booked out, and we had to keep driving. However, just out of town was this mid-19th century 2-story Victorian-style house, converted to a B&B, and it had vacancy. We parked in the driveway and made some inquiries. We were greeted by a short man in his mid-40s, wearing reading glasses and what seemed like a wig. I imagined that he would be the owner. "How can I help you?" "Please come in, it's getting cold. We have the fireplace on," he said. "We're after a room for the night and some dinner. Do you have any rooms available? And how much for that night?" "The house has 5 rooms, all vacant tonight, and cost $200 a night, including breakfast." I looked at my girlfriend. Our budget was $40 for a motel room, and $200 was way too much, even though it was probably worth it since the decoration and furniture were done to the period, and the house did have a romantic feeling. "Sorry, this is above our budget. We'll need to find somewhere else," I replied. I understand. For you to consider, we have a small 3-bedroom cottage next door. It used to be the caretaker's, and it's empty tonight. You can have it all to yourselves, and we can make it for $90. We accepted this offer since driving any further could be dangerous. We were shown this weatherboard cottage, which had a small veranda at the front. Upon entering, there was a large corridor with the main bedroom on your left, the other bedrooms on the right, a small lounge room in the middle of the house, followed by a kitchen and a large bathroom in the back. The man lit the fireplace, showed us around, and said goodnight. For dinner, we ate some leftover sandwiches and fruit that we had and went to bed. Gecko. We couldn't find any blankets, which was odd given the temperature outside was below freezing. At night, I woke up and decided to go to the toilet. As I opened the door, I saw this 5-foot woman, early 50s, wearing an old-style long black dress, dark hair pulled up, staring right at me. It was wary and somehow knew it was a ghost. I jumped, went back to the bedroom, closed the door, woke up my girlfriend, and told her I just saw a ghost. We both covered ourselves and heads underneath everything, and interestingly went back to sleep straight away. Around 6:30 a.m. we woke up, had a shower, packed up our things, and went to the main house. The man greeted us. "Are you ready for breakfast? But before, if you're interested, I can give you a tour of the house." Since he was almost blocking the way to the dining room and his arms were showing the stairs, we ended up seeing the whole house. It was creepy somehow. After breakfast, we paid and left. "Jez, that man was strange, didn't you find?" I said to my girlfriend. "Which man are you talking about?" she replied. "The owner, who else?" "I never saw any man. The owner was a woman." She described the woman and had nothing to do with the man. Better forget this whole episode, we concluded. Never mention any of this to our friends, as they'll probably think we're crazy, and we just laughed it off. Around 2016, I remembered this story and did a Google search and found this B&B. To my surprise, in the About Us section, there was a picture of the original owner, a mid-aged couple, and the woman was the owner, wearing the same dress and with the same hairdo, exactly like I saw her. Gave me goosebumps. That's the end of today's stories. My gecko is all the way across the house, and I do apologize if you hear him interrupting. And a quick shout out to Perfectly Imperfect. Thanks for always dropping those comments. Helps us on the algorithm and helps us feel good about our work. As always, see you later. Have a great night.